My husband hid his other family for 10 years, until one phone call changed everything. The ringing phone pierced the quiet of our kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon as I stirred pasta sauce for dinner, expecting James home from his business trip by 7. Our routine was well established after 15 years of marriage. He traveled 3 days a week for his consulting job, and I maintained our beautiful colonial home in Connecticut while running my small interior design business from the sunroom office. We had built a comfortable life together, one that many of our friends envied for its apparent perfection. James and I had met in graduate school, married a year after graduation, and pursued our careers with equal dedication. We had chosen not to have children, instead filling our lives with travel, dinner parties, and the companionship of our 2 golden retrievers. The decision had seemed mutual and uncomplicated at the time, though occasionally I caught something wistful in James's expression when we visited friends with children. I had always dismissed it as momentary nostalgia rather than genuine regret, confident in the choices we had made together. Little did I know that this ordinary Tuesday would shatter the foundation of everything I believed about our marriage, our choices, and the man I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. I wiped my hands on a dish towel before answering the phone, expecting a client or perhaps my sister calling about our upcoming vacation plans. Instead, a young woman's voice, hesitant and slightly accented, asked for James. When I explained he was traveling for work, there was a pause so prolonged I nearly hung up, assuming it was a sales call. Then she spoke again, her words careful and measured. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Eliza. I'm calling from Philadelphia. I think James is my father." The wooden spoon I had been using to stir the sauce clattered to the floor, splattering red across the terracotta tiles. My first thought was that this must be a mistake, a wrong number, or perhaps a scam of some kind. James and I had no children. We had made that decision together. I had never been pregnant. It simply wasn't possible. I told the young woman as much, my voice steady despite the sudden racing of my heart. But something in her quiet confidence gave me pause, as she asked if James Montgomery was my husband, if he was 45 years old, if he had a small crescent-shaped scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident. Details that couldn't be coincidental, couldn't be guessed. Details that confirmed she knew my husband in some capacity that I couldn't immediately dismiss. Suddenly, without warning, the pasta sauce began to boil over, hissing as it hit the stovetop burner. I turned off the heat mechanically, one hand still clutching the phone to my ear as Eliza continued to speak. She was 20 years old, a sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania. Her mother's name was Nadia, and she had met James in Philadelphia during a business conference 11 years ago. According to this stranger, what had begun as a brief affair had evolved into something more permanent, more structured. A second life that James maintained during his frequent business trips to the city. A life that included not just Eliza but her 9-year-old brother Max as well. 2 children I had never known existed. 2 children who called my husband Dad, while I believed we had chosen a child-free life together. The room seemed to tilt around me as I gripped the counter for support, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, perhaps even malicious intent behind this call. Yet the calm, apologetic tone of the young woman on the other end of the line carried a ring of truth that was impossible to ignore completely. I asked why she was calling now, after all this time. Her answer was simple and devastating. Nadia had been diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer, and the prognosis was poor. Medical bills were mounting, and James had apparently stopped answering Nadia's calls 3 weeks ago. Eliza had found our home number among her mother's papers and made the decision to reach out directly. She hadn't known if I existed, if James was married, if there was a reason he had suddenly disappeared from their lives at such a critical moment. The revelation that I was as much in the dark as she was seemed to shock her into silence. We both breathed into the phone for several long moments, 2 strangers connected by a man who had apparently betrayed us both in different ways. Finally, I asked for her contact information, promised to speak with James when he returned, and hung up with hands that had gone numb and cold despite the warm spring evening. The dogs nudged at my legs, sensing my distress, but I could barely acknowledge them as I sank into a kitchen chair, the half-prepared dinner forgotten on the stove. The next 5 hours were among the longest of my life. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching photographs of our vacations, running my fingers over James's books and records, examining his handwriting on birthday cards saved in a memory box. I was searching for clues, for warning signs I might have missed, for some indication that the man I had built my life around was capable of such elaborate deception. Had there been unexplained expenses? Late-night phone calls he took in another room? Schedule changes that should have raised suspicion? I scrolled through our joint bank account, finding nothing obvious, but then James had always maintained a separate account for his consulting income, handling those finances himself while our joint account covered household expenses. An arrangement I had never questioned, focused on my own business and the freedom of our dual-income, child-free lifestyle. Now every business trip, every late meeting, every weekend conference took on a sinister new meaning. Had he been with them? Had he kissed his children goodnight before calling to wish me sweet dreams? Had he celebrated birthdays, attended school plays, tucked them in with bedtime stories while I believed he was closing deals in hotel conference rooms? At 6:45, headlights swept across the front windows as James's car pulled into the driveway. I had moved to the living room, sitting in the half-dark with a glass of wine untouched on the side table. My mind had cycled through shock, grief, rage, and disbelief, finally settling into a strange, detached calm. I needed answers more than I needed to express the hurricane of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I heard his key in the lock, the familiar sound of his briefcase being set down in the entryway, his cheerful greeting to the dogs who rushed to meet him. Then his footsteps paused, no doubt noticing the uncharacteristic darkness of the house, the absence of cooking smells from our usual homecoming dinner. "Catherine?" he called, his voice shifting from casual to concern in those 3 syllables. I didn't answer, waiting as he moved through the dining room and appeared in the doorway of the living room. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 days ago when he kissed me goodbye. The same slightly rumpled dress shirt, the same wire-framed glasses, the same crescent scar above his eyebrow that his daughter had described so precisely on the phone. My husband of 15 years, a stranger. "Is everything okay?" he asked, reaching for the light switch. I stopped him with a raised hand, not ready to see his face in full illumination, not ready to search for traces of the man I thought I knew in his expression. "Eliza called today," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my hands. The effect was immediate and confirming. He staggered slightly as if physically struck, one hand reaching for the doorframe to steady himself. If there had been any last hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, it evaporated in that moment of unguarded reaction. He knew exactly who Eliza was. He knew what her call meant, and the naked fear in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about the truth of her story. "Catherine, I can explain," he began, but I cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Explain what? 10 years of systematic deception, a second family, hidden less than 3 hours away? The fact that while I believed we had made a mutual decision to remain child-free, he was raising 2 children with another woman?" The conversation that followed was both surreal and agonizing. James sank into the armchair across from me, shoulders slumped in defeat as the secrets of a decade unraveled between us. He had met Nadia during a conference in Philadelphia, as Eliza had said, shortly after we had finalized our decision not to have children. What began as a brief affair became complicated when Nadia discovered she was pregnant. He had intended to end it, to confess everything to me, but couldn't bring himself to destroy our marriage. Instead, he had compartmentalized his life with a skill that was both impressive and horrifying. Business trips were carefully scheduled to allow time in Philadelphia. The separate bank account funded an apartment, child support, school tuition. His phone contained a second contact list under a password-protected app. 2 lives, 2 families, maintained with meticulous attention to detail for more than a decade. He spoke with a strange mixture of shame and relief, as if unburdening himself of this massive deception was both painful and cathartic. I listened in silence, my mind struggling to reconcile the man before me with the husband I had trusted implicitly for 15 years. When he finally fell silent, the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 times, marking the hour with the same reliability it had shown since we inherited it from my parents. The familiar sound in the midst of this unfamiliar nightmare grounded me somehow, reminded me that time was still moving forward, despite the fact that my past had just been completely rewritten. I asked the question that had been burning since Eliza's call, the one whose answer I dreaded most. Did you ever love me at all, or was I just the convenient wife who made your other life possible? James looked genuinely stricken, reaching for my hand across the coffee table between us. I pulled back before he could touch me, not ready for physical contact that had suddenly become unbearable. Catherine, I have always loved you, he insisted, his voice breaking. This wasn't about not loving you. It was about, I don't know, not being able to give up anything, not being strong enough to make a choice, wanting everything even when I knew it was wrong. His explanation was perhaps the most honest moment in our conversation, laying bare a selfishness so profound it had shaped all our lives without our knowledge or consent. My husband hid his other family for 10 years until one phone call changed everything. The reality of my situation hit me with renewed force as I contemplated my next steps. Did I throw away 15 years of marriage? Did I forgive the unforgivable? Could our relationship ever recover from a betrayal so complete it called into question every memory, every moment we had shared? And what about Nadia and the children, his children, facing a health crisis without his support? The complexity of the situation was overwhelming, layers of deception and consequences that extended far beyond our living room, beyond our marriage, touching lives that, until today, I hadn't known existed. I stood abruptly, needing physical distance, needing to think without James's presence clouding my judgment. I'm going to stay at Sarah's tonight, I said, referring to my closest friend who lived a few blocks away. Don't call me. Don't try to explain further. I need space to process this. He nodded, looking suddenly older than his 45 years, the weight of his double life visibly pressing down on his shoulders now that it was exposed to the light. I packed a small overnight bag with mechanical efficiency, called Sarah to give her the briefest explanation of why I needed emergency housing, and left James sitting in our darkened living room with the dogs whining in confusion at my abrupt departure. The night air was cool on my face as I backed out of the driveway, offering a momentary clarity that had eluded me inside the house that no longer felt like home. As I drove the familiar streets to Sarah's condo, my mind replayed moments from our marriage in rapid succession. Our wedding day, James's expression as he promised fidelity and honesty, vacation photographs with his arm around my waist, late-night conversations about our future, our goals, our choice to focus on each other rather than children. Had he been thinking of Eliza and Max during those conversations? Had he been comparing our life to his other family, evaluating which offered him more satisfaction? The thought made me physically ill, forcing me to pull over briefly to combat a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. By the time I reached Sarah's, I had cycled through shock and anger again, arriving at her door with red-rimmed eyes and a determination to survive whatever came next. Sarah, to her credit, asked few questions that first night, settling me in her guest room with a glass of bourbon and a promise that everything would seem clearer in the morning. It didn't, of course. The morning brought only the harsh reality that this wasn't a nightmare I could wake from, but my new normal. I called my office and rescheduled appointments, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue. Then I sat at Sarah's kitchen table, surrounded by notes I had made during the sleepless night, questions that needed answers, decisions that needed to be made, financial and legal considerations that couldn't be ignored despite my emotional turmoil. The most pressing concern, beyond my own shattered marriage, was the situation with Nadia and the children. Whatever James had done, whatever our future held, there were 2 innocent children involved who deserved support. There was a woman fighting cancer who had apparently been abandoned by the man who had promised to be there for her and their family. My anger toward James didn't eclipse my concern for them. a fact that surprised me even as I acknowledged it. With Sarah's encouragement, I called Eliza again, this time prepared for the conversation in a way I hadn't been the day before. She answered on the second ring, her voice anxious and hopeful simultaneously. I confirmed that I had spoken with James, that her story was accurate as far as I could determine, and then asked about her mother's condition. The details were grim: stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive treatment protocols, mounting medical bills despite insurance, and the practical challenges of caring for a 9-year-old while undergoing chemotherapy. As Eliza spoke, I could hear the strain in her voice, the burden of responsibility that had fallen on her young shoulders. She was trying to maintain her college studies while supporting her mother and brother, a juggling act that would challenge someone twice her age. I found myself admiring her resilience, even as I struggled with the complex emotions of speaking to my husband's daughter, a young woman whose existence represented a decade of betrayal, but who herself had done nothing wrong. By the end of our conversation, I had promised to ensure that financial support resumed immediately, regardless of what happened between James and me. It was a commitment made not out of obligation, but out of basic human decency, a recognition that the ripple effects of James's choices spread far beyond our marriage. When I returned to our house 3 days later, it was with a clarity of purpose that had emerged from the fog of shock and betrayal. James had called and texted repeatedly, his messages alternating between apologies, explanations, and increasingly desperate pleas for a chance to talk face to face. I had responded only once, a brief text, "I'm coming home Thursday at 2. Be there." He was waiting on the front porch when I arrived, unshaven and hollow-eyed, looking as if he hadn't slept since I left. The dogs bounded down the steps to greet me, their uncomplicated joy a stark contrast to the tension between their owners. I brushed past James without greeting, entering the house and settling at the dining room table where I had laid out a legal pad with my prepared points. He followed silently, taking the seat across from me with the air of a man awaiting sentencing. "I've spoken with Eliza again," I began without preamble. "I've also consulted a lawyer about our options. Here's how this is going to work." The speech I had rehearsed flowed with surprising steadiness: immediate financial support for Nadia and the children, separate living arrangements while I decided whether divorce was inevitable, full disclosure of all accounts and assets, and a preliminary division of our practical entanglements while emotional ones remained too raw to address. James accepted my terms without argument, a passive compliance that might have seemed like contrition but struck me more as exhaustion now that the weight of his deception had been lifted. When I finished outlining my requirements, he reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew his wallet, removing a small photograph that he placed carefully on the table between us. 2 children smiled up from the glossy surface, a teenage girl with James's eyes and a younger boy with his distinctive jawline. His children, strangers to me who shared my husband's DNA, his features, perhaps elements of his personality that I would never know. "They're good kids," he said quietly, his first words since I'd begun speaking. "They deserve better than what I've done to all of us." It wasn't an excuse or a justification, just a simple truth that hung in the air between us. I didn't touch the photograph but found myself studying their faces, searching for the man I had loved in their features, wondering about the lives they had lived parallel to mine, invisible yet profoundly connected. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to my days, one focused on practical matters rather than the emotional devastation I wasn't yet ready to fully process. James moved into a hotel, then a small apartment across town. I continued running my design business, finding unexpected solace in the creativity and problem-solving my work required. We communicated primarily through email and our respective lawyers, though occasionally logistics required direct conversation. During one such exchange regarding the dog's veterinary appointments, James mentioned that he had visited Philadelphia, had seen Nadia and the children. He described Nadia's fatigue from treatment, Max's struggle to understand why his mother was sick, Eliza's determination to hold everything together. There was genuine concern in his voice, a paternal worry that sounded alien to me after 15 years of believing he didn't want children. It was one more disconnection between the man I had married and the man he actually was, a father who cared deeply for his children, who had maintained that connection, despite the compartmentalization of his life. The revelation was both humanizing and devastating, forcing me to recognize that his deception hadn't been merely selfish indulgence, but something more complex, a web of commitments and attachments he had been unwilling to relinquish, even at the cost of his integrity. 3 months after Eliza's fateful phone call, I found myself driving to Philadelphia on a Saturday morning, gripping the steering wheel with sweaty hands as I followed GPS directions to an address I had memorized but never visited. The decision to make this journey hadn't come easily, evolving gradually from a nagging thought to an inevitable necessity. I needed to see this other life with my own eyes, to meet the people who had unknowingly shared my husband for a decade. Nadia had agreed to the meeting with surprising grace when I called, her accented voice warm despite the awkwardness of our connection. "It is time we meet, I think," she had said simply. "The children are with friends tomorrow morning. We can talk woman to woman." The apartment building was modest but well-maintained, flowers spilling from window boxes despite the summer heat. I parked across the street, taking several deep breaths before gathering the courage to approach the entrance. My finger hovered over the buzzer for apartment 3B before finally pressing, the metallic sound seeming to echo my racing heartbeat. The woman who opened the door was not what I had expected, though I wasn't sure what I had expected. Perhaps someone younger, more beautiful, someone who represented everything I wasn't, the cliché of the other woman from films and novels. Instead, Nadia was approximately my age, her once dark hair now growing back in sparse patches after chemotherapy, her slender frame showing the weight loss of illness and treatment. She wore a colorful headscarf and a simple linen dress, her smile tentative but genuine as she gestured me inside. The apartment was small but thoughtfully decorated, bookshelves overflowing with volumes in multiple languages, children's artwork framed alongside professional photography. A life fully lived, not the shadowy existence I had imagined in my darkest moments. We sat at her kitchen table, the awkwardness of our situation hanging between us until Nadia poured tea from a ceramic pot, the ritual providing structure to our unprecedented encounter. "Thank you for helping with the medical bills," she began, her direct approach catching me off guard. "Eliza told me what you did. It was unexpected. Kind," I nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude for what had seemed like basic decency rather than extraordinary generosity. "They're James's children," I said simply. "Whatever happened between the adults, they shouldn't suffer." The conversation that unfolded over the next 2 hours was unlike any I had ever experienced. Raw, honest, occasionally painful, but illuminating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Nadia spoke of meeting James, of falling in love despite knowing he was married, of the complicated decisions that led to Eliza's birth and the life they had built together. She didn't excuse her role in the deception, but offered context that complicated my understanding of the situation. James had been clear about his marriage from the beginning, had initially positioned himself as a supportive friend and financial provider rather than a full-time parent. It was only as the children grew, as his attachment to them deepened, that his involvement became more consistent, more paternal. Nadia hadn't demanded this evolution. It had emerged naturally from James's own desires, his own choices. She showed me photographs, James teaching Max to ride a bicycle, attending Eliza's middle school graduation, ordinary moments of a family life that had existed alongside mine like a parallel universe. Each image was another piece of the puzzle, helping me construct a more complete picture of the man who had moved between these worlds with such apparent ease. As our conversation drew to a close, Nadia retrieved a small box from a bookshelf, hesitating before placing it before me. "The children have made things for you since learning about you," she explained. "They wanted you to have them. It is their way of connecting, I think." Inside were handmade items, a beaded bracelet from Eliza with a small note explaining that the colors represented healing in her art therapy class, a drawing from Max of what appeared to be all of us together, stick figures labeled with our names, including James in the center. The simple gifts pierced my carefully maintained composure in a way nothing else had, bringing tears I had managed to suppress throughout our conversation. These children, who had every right to resent my existence as their father's other life, had instead reached out with compassion, with a desire for connection rather than division. Their capacity for grace stood in stark contrast to the adult complexities that had shaped their lives without their knowledge or consent. The drive home from Philadelphia was filled with turbulent thoughts, windows down to let the summer air clear my head as I processed everything I had learned. The narrative I had constructed around James's betrayal, a simple story of selfishness and deception, had become infinitely more nuanced after meeting Nadia, seeing the home he had helped create, understanding the relationships that had developed over a decade. This didn't excuse his actions. The fundamental betrayal remained unaltered. But my understanding of it had shifted, expanded, to include the recognition that James had not been living a lie in either place. He had been genuinely present in both lives, genuinely attached to both families, genuinely torn between commitments that should have been mutually exclusive, but which he had somehow maintained through elaborate compartmentalization. It was, in its way, a testament to how thoroughly one person could fragment themselves, a Greek tragedy of modern proportions, a man divided against himself, until the inevitable collapse. 6 months after Eliza's phone call changed everything, I sat across from James at a neutral location, a quiet corner table in a cafe midway between our respective new residences. The divorce papers had been finalized a week earlier, dissolving 15 years of marriage with surprising efficiency once financial matters were settled. James had been generous in the division of assets, accepting my terms without negotiation, his focus seemingly more on maintaining support for Nadia and the children than on his own financial security. We had agreed to meet one last time, not to revisit painful territory, but to achieve some kind of closure before moving forward on our separate paths. The James who sat before me was changed from the husband I'd known. Thinner, grayer at the temples, a new pair of glasses framing eyes that held a weariness I recognized from my own mirror. We exchanged pleasantries about the dogs, who were staying primarily with me but visited him regularly, about mutual friends who had navigated the awkwardness of our situation with varying degrees of success, about the practical matters that still occasionally required coordination. Eventually, the conversation turned to Nadia, whose treatment was showing promising results, and to the children, who were adjusting to the new openness between their previously separated worlds. James spoke of them with obvious pride and concern, emotions I now understood had been present but hidden throughout our marriage. "Eliza is applying to graduate programs," he said, a small smile softening his features. "Environmental science. She's brilliant, focused. Max is struggling a bit more with everything, but he's resilient. Therapy is helping." I nodded, genuinely interested, despite the lingering pain associated with these reminders of his other life. I had maintained contact with Eliza, occasional text messages and emails that had evolved into a tentative relationship, separate from her father. She had even visited me once, a brief afternoon spent walking the dogs and talking about her studies, carefully avoiding the more complicated aspects of our connection. It wasn't friendship exactly, but something uniquely its own. A bridge between worlds that had been forcibly collapsed into one another. As our coffee cups emptied and the afternoon light began to fade, I found myself asking the question that had haunted me since the beginning, the one I hadn't been ready to hear answered until now. Do you regret it? Not the hurt you caused, but the choice itself. Having children with Nadia while pretending to be content without them with me. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something distant beyond the cafe window. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but tinged with the regret he had carried visibly these past months. "I regret the deception, the damage it caused to everyone involved. But Eliza and Max? No, I could never regret them. They're the best parts of my life, even now." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "What I truly regret is not being honest with you from the beginning, about wanting children, about everything. We might have made different choices together or gone our separate ways before investing 15 years in a future that wasn't aligned with what either of us truly wanted. That's the real tragedy here, not just the lies, but the lost opportunity for both of us to live authentic lives. Walking back to my car after our goodbye, which had been awkward but not unkind, I found myself reflecting on James's parting words. There was truth in what he had said about authenticity, about the life I might have lived had I known all the variables, all his true desires and priorities. But there was also something liberating in the recognition that I now had an opportunity to discover what an authentic life meant for me, untethered from the foundation of deception that had unknowingly shaped my choices for so long. The betrayal had been devastating, the grief of losing both my marriage and my understanding of my own past profound. Yet standing in the late afternoon sunlight, keys in hand and future unwritten, I felt something unexpected stirring beneath the lingering pain. A cautious optimism about what might come next, about the person I might become now that the illusion had been shattered and reality, however difficult, had taken its place. My husband hid his other family for 10 years, until one phone call changed everything. The title of this chapter of my life was undeniable in its accuracy. Everything had indeed changed: my marriage, my home, my understanding of the past, my vision of the future. But as I started my car and pulled away from the cafe where I had said goodbye to 15 years and the man who had shaped them, I realized that everything included me. I had changed too, emerging from the crucible of betrayal not unmarked but unbroken, carrying forward not just the scars of what had happened, but the wisdom, the strength, and the hard-won clarity that only comes from surviving what once seemed unsurvivable.